This video is brought to you by Squarespace.
You know, it's been a year since I last updated YouTube on what my top 10 favorite book series of all time are. That's what we're doing in today's video. But before we get into the list, let us hear a word from today's sponsor, Squarespace. Yes, that's right, Squarespace. No, you haven't heard of it? Well, guess what? Listen up. Squarespace is an all-in-one internet website platform that allows you to customize and personalize your presence online in the blink of an eye. One of the ways they help you accomplish this is with their Blueprint AI. No, it's not that kind of AI, so don't be frightened. Blueprint AI is Squarespace's new guided design system that helps you personalize and customize your website to give it that oh-so-unique touch online. It also helps you create layouts to help you build this website from the ground up while removing all the hassle of trying to do this on your own. And Squarespace provides you with optimized integrated SEO tools that help you launch your website quickly, get discovered more often, and grow the way that you desire. So head on over to squarespace.com for your free trial today, or go to squarespace.com/IanGubeli for 10% off your first website and/or domain. Back to the top 10. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And while you're at it, please drop a comment down in the description. I challenge you to give me your top 10 series of all time. And if you can't come up with 10, drop me a nice recommendation of your favorite series. Maybe I will check it out on the channel. Without further ado, number 10 is the Isaiah Trilogy by Laird Barron. This is a recent read for me. This is like an urban crime noir thriller series. We follow a man named Isaiah Coleridge. How could we deduce that, right? Isaiah has ties to the mafia. You could say that he's a hitman for the mob. And one day he steps on a very violent, very unstable mob boss's toes. So he therefore has to relocate from remote Alaska, where he's lived pretty much his entire life, to upstate New York. He's now in hiding from this man and his cronies. It's really interesting to see that over the course of these three novels, he goes from this mafia hitman to a private investigator. He goes on manhunts trying to find missing persons. He's getting involved with skirmishes of like neo-Nazi, skinhead, racist gangs, Native Indian militias. He's tracking down serial killers with connections to the mob. But there's so much to these books. The writing is fast-paced. The plot never slows down. Laird Barron really has a wit and a humor to his writing, but there's also this intelligence behind everything. He's a very well-read person, and so that really shines forth not only in his writing, but particularly the character of Isaiah. He's a very sarcastic, witty person, but behind that rough and tough exterior, he's a reader. These books feel as if it's, you know, True Detective meets Billy Summers by Stephen King. I think the two best aspects to this series, of course, are the writing. I love the prose, and of course, the twists and turns. I mean, it's a plot that keeps you guessing at every turn. The overall rating of this series, I would give a 4.5. Each book is so close to being a 5-star read. Sometimes the plot jumps a little too much, and I kind of get left behind. You know, maybe that's just a personal thing with me. Number 9, guys, I have gone back and forth for days now on what number 9 should be, and I think I finally pinpointed it. It is The Witcher Saga by Andrzej Sapkowski. This is a high fantasy, epic fantasy with all of the classic fantasy races. You have elves, you have dwarves. We follow a character known as Geralt of Rivia, and he is in the profession of being a witcher. Now, witchers are essentially hybrid mutant human beings who are created by magic and scientific experimentation to essentially hunt and slay monsters. It's so fun. It's brutal, it's dark, but it's so fun. It's very compelling and very thought-provoking at the same time. Sapkowski writes about a lot of very interesting issues, but I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on what those are in a vlog because I've started rereading the Witcher books. I think the best aspects of the Witcher Saga is that it is like the perfect blending of classical fantasy and modern fantasy. Having been written in the 90s, I feel like it gets kind of forgotten sometimes. I don't really see it talked about as much on YouTube, and it is just, I mean, it's amazing. It's like that perfect blend. It has all those classical tropes, sometimes classical prose, but then it has that modern sense in which it's no longer trying to be a Tolkien clone, it's trying to be its own thing. Overall, I give the series a 4.5. There are some 5-star books in this series. I just have 2 issues with it. One, of course, there's some weird sexual stuff that you have to skip around, and it's just completely unnecessary. But I think the biggest thing is that the series was originally written in Polish, and so from Polish to English there's some things that are lost in translation, specifically to do with the plot. Sapkowski will sometimes introduce side characters and what they're going going through and consequences of certain things. And then he'll move on, and then you never come back to those characters, like ever. So the plot sometimes feels a bit choppy. Number 8 is The Warlord Chronicles by Bernard Cornwell. This is an amazing historical fiction trilogy. Bernard Cornwell is a stud. This is Bernard Cornwell's interpretation of what a story about Arthur would look like. Most of us are used to stories of Arthur being told from the perspective that he is a king, or that he's this orphan, or he's this child that becomes a king. Bernard Cornwell takes a different approach. In this series, it's all about Arthur's exploits as a warlord and how he unites Britain and how he doesn't want to be a king. And the interesting thing is that it's not told from Arthur's perspective. It's actually told from a first-person perspective of a man named Derval, who actually is a very close friend to Arthur eventually in the story. It's one of the most beautifully written stories I've ever read. Bernard Cornwell kind of takes you on such a journey with the medieval politics, with the strifes between pagans and Christians. He's very faithful to what the 4th century would have looked like in Britain. I think the best aspects to this trilogy are, one, the prose. The prose is some of the most beautiful writing I've ever read in my life. That first sentence to that first book still sticks with me today. He wrote something like, "Once upon a time, in a land called Britain, these things happened." And from that first sentence, I knew I was going to enjoy everything that came afterwards. I was not let down. Another thing that I really love about this is that it is historical fiction, but it reads like a fantasy. It feels like sometimes there's a magical realism aspect to it. I definitely rate this entire series a 4.5. There are some moments that drag a little bit, but I think every author has that. Number 7 is definitely The First Law by Joe Abercrombie. It pains me to put The First Law all the way down at number 7 because I think last year I think I had it at number 3. It just goes to show you that I've read so many amazing series since that time. The First Law by Joe Abercrombie is probably the quintessential grimdark fantasy series. It is known for being brutal, bleak, and at sometimes very hopeless. All of the characters are morally gray. We're following a Northman who is a champion of the North. It's kind of hard to go into what that means, but let's just say dude has killed a lot. And I mean a lot of people. He wants to change his ways. He doesn't want to be a bloodthirsty murderer anymore. We follow a runaway slave who wants to take revenge on the empire that enslaved her people. We follow a group of Northmen, particularly from the perspective of one Northman, but you kind of get all 5 of these guys in the same chapters, and it's really funny, and they're trying to rebel against the King of the North, or the self-proclaimed King of the North, and they're just a mess, dude. They are a mess of characters. We follow an entitled young nobleman who is trying to become the greatest swordsmaster of his time, but he's a womanizer and kind of a drunkard and a gambler, and he's just dumpster fire of a human being. He's terrible. He's such a bad person. And then the cream of the crop among them all is prisoner of war turned torturer for his kingdom, and he is a vile, nasty, crooked human being. It's more of a book of plots than it is of one plot. But Joe Abercrombie takes all of those kind of classical fantasy tropes and he twists them on their heads. Like, I think the best aspect of The First Law is Joe Abercrombie's character work. He does characters like nobody else, and I think it's because he's a master of tone of voice. You will find yourself reading this series, you will come to a chapter, before the point of view character's name is even mentioned, you know what chapter you're on, because just the voice, every single character's tone of voice is different and unique, and I really don't understand how he's able to do that, how he's able to make so many characters sound on paper so unique from each other. The series' overall rating is a 4.75. Only thing that I hate about it is the sexual content, because it serves no purpose. Without that element to it, I think all of these books would be perfect. All right, number 6. This is also another series that hurts me to place it this low because it was at number 2 last year, and that is John Gwynn's The Faithful and the Fallen. Oh my gosh! The Faithful and the Fallen is a 4-book epic fantasy epic that just latches onto you and doesn't let you go. It's kind of hard to describe the plot because, again, it's one of those multiple POV cast, and it's a large cast. I mean, book 1, I think we follow 6 points of views, and by book 4, we're following like 10 or 12. It's a lot of character point of views that we're following, and they're all super important, but I think at the core of this story is, it's a coming-of-age story about a boy named Corbin. He's just in this little fishing village, and all he wants to be is a great warrior. Classic fantasy, right? He gets swept up in an ancient prophecy, and by the end of it, I mean, he's freaking fighting against angelic and demonic forces, literally. This story gets so big. It's a little bit slow in the beginning. I think the first 200 pages or so of that first book, it's a lot of setting up. Every single one of these books made me cry. I was so invested in the characters and what was happening to them and the choices and decisions they were making and the things that were going on between them. John Gwynne is one of those masters at making characters, man. And the story, of course, the plot is so big and there's so much to it. I mean, dude, epic fantasy at its best. I really have to say that. And the fact that it's a debut blows my mind even more, that these are like his first books. The best aspect to this series is the world building. It's not world building in the normal sense of just like John Gwynne narrating, oh, this is what the world is like, and giving you history through exposition. I think the unique thing about this series is that he world builds through conversations between characters. Like, all world building is done through dialogue. And the same thing with the magic. The magic is not this overpowering thing of the plot. It's not this very in your face, in the forefront kind of thing. It's this subtle thing between characters. And I think that's why this series is so magical, because everything is done between character relationships, and that's what makes it so engaging. This is definitely a 5-star series. Hands down, all 4 of these books are 5 stars. Perfect from beginning to end. Definitely recommend going into it blind. Don't look up reviews. Don't look up anything. Just pick up these books and read them. Number 5 is Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling. That series was lower last year. I believe it was like number 8 on the list. And I reread it for the fall. Upon rereading it, I realized how insanely good that series is. Like, there's a reason it's the most sold book series of all time. Harry Potter is the story of an orphan boy named Harry Potter. If you didn't know that. He finds out on his 11th birthday that he is a wizard. He's a person with a predisposition towards magic. And he is lifted away to this magical school called Hogwarts. And from there, the series ultimately comes down to one of the greatest showdown of good versus evil I've ever read in my life, man. You can tell J.K. Rowling took her time. She thought about every little detail. You could tell the care and the attention to detail that was put into all of this. It's absolutely stunning. The best aspect to this series is the magic and the world building. For those of you who know what my taste is as a reader, I'm not a hard magic system fan. Magic and fantasy to be kind of take a backseat. I don't really want things explained. I don't really want to know the ins and out of how things work or how a certain character can use their magical abilities. I just want something to be magical, and that's it. But when it comes to Harry Potter, I was so fascinated with everything about how the magic worked, how the magic could be done, the do's and don'ts, the rules, the consequences. Everything about it was so intriguing to me. And I think the best part is that JK teaches you about this magical system and this magical world through the eyes of this young boy, Harry Potter, who's learning these things at the same time you are. And of course, the world building, the wizarding world and how it has to be secretive, really, really exceptional. It's a 5-star series, hands down. The majority of these books are 5 stars. At the beginning of the series, it's kind of slow and it feels a little bit more childish, but as you progress, it gets more mature and it definitely grows into something that I think is more of an adult fiction series. All right, number 4. Number 4 has to be The Dark Tower by Stephen King. The Dark Tower, what to even say? It is the most unique series I've ever read. We follow the last gunslinger, Roland Deschain, as he makes his way across Endworld into Midworld to try and stop the collapse of the Dark Tower. Now, there is so much in between the lines of what I just said that I do not have time on this video to explain it. There's so much good content out there about what that all means, but it's hard to express really the story of the Dark Tower. There's so many other stories in Stephen King's repertoire of amazing novels that tie into this series. The Dark Tower is like the pinnacle achievement of Stephen King and how he's tied pretty much everything he's ever written together in one cohesive story. And what I mean by that is there's things that are mentioned, say, in the book It. There's things that are mentioned that have huge importance in the Dark Tower. Same thing with, say, The Stand. There's a character that kind of seems to jump between worlds and jump between stories, and he's in The Stand as well as the Dark Tower. And there's so many references that he uses throughout his other works that tie into the Dark Tower. And this series as a whole is just insane, man. It is like the imaginative peak of Stephen King. Talk about a guy who's achieved a lot in his life. This is an achievement that is so far above everything else that he's ever done. The story is incredible. The writing is incredible. The world and the story and how it's technically a fantasy series, but he mixes so many other things into it. There's Western elements, but then there's like a post-apocalyptic feeling to the world. And then it's also kind of dystopian at other places. And then there's magical realism, of course, because it's fantasy. But then there's also science fiction elements to it as well. I mean, there's so much to this series. This series is definitely probably the most divisive thing Stephen King has ever written, especially when it comes to the ending. I happen to land somewhere in the middle of, I liked the ending. I think it was really beautiful, really nicely wrapped up. But at the same time, it's kind of like, I see why people would be so upset. Overall, I think the best aspect to this, what is the best aspect to The Dark Tower? It's just how unique it is. You will read nothing like it because there's nothing like it. I still don't know how to describe these bloody books. Okay, just read them. Overall, it's definitely like a 4.75 just because sometimes it gets weird. It gets really weird. I think book 6 and book 7 were just a little strange at points, but I love them. This series is definitely well worth your time. Oh, top 3! Number 3 is A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin, or as it's more commonly known, A Game of Thrones. This series is a high epic grimdark fantasy. It's fantasy that reads like historical fiction. Listening to interviews and hearing George's thoughts on that sentiment, he says that's the highest form of praise for his series. I mean, he nailed it. He freaking nailed it. And it's one of those multiple POV, very large cast of characters that you're following. This series is a masterclass in political intrigue and dialogue between characters. Everything is on the brink of war. I mean, tensions are always so high. When you think the stakes can't get any higher, he keeps raising them somehow. Dude, there's nobody that does a plot twists like George Martin, man. The best aspect to this series is definitely the prose. His prose is beautiful. I think unmatched. He's definitely my favorite writer. And then I think the thing that he's the best at compared to everybody else on this list is dialogue. Conversations between these characters feel real. You feel like a fly on the wall, listening to real people speak about real things. He gets you so invested by just the words that people speak to one another. Overall, that 5-star rating to this series for sure. The elephant in the room with this series is the sexual content. Obviously, I've heard it said that the books don't come anywhere close to the sexual content of the series. The series kind of pushed the envelope when it came to that. Definitely a lot of sexual content that you have to skip. It's never important, so just be aware of that. Number 2, Pierce Brown's Rising Saga. Having read all of the books up to date, I can say with absolute confidence that this series deserves the number 2 spot. Pierce Brown has written one of the greatest science fiction series ever written. Has to, especially probably the greatest science fiction series of the 21st century, I would say. We're set in a dystopian future. Humanity has been essentially color-coded biologically. At the top of the pyramid, we have the gold caste. They kind of rule everything. Cream of the crop. And at the bottom of the caste system are the reds. Our main character is a red named Darrow. Him and his people mine this substance on Mars that helps the society terraform more worlds so that they can expand humanity into the reaches of the galaxy. He finds out that his entire life has been a lie. And it becomes one of the greatest revenge stories. It doesn't stay that way. It doesn't stay just him seeking revenge. It becomes this battle for truth, what is right and what is good. I think the thing that Pierce Brown does best with this whole series, especially if you've read all 6 of them, he makes you ask yourself some very hard questions because you love Darrow and you love the main characters that he assembles around him. Of course, the bad guys, we hate them all. We hate them all. But he makes you ask yourself this question of who's really in the right. He doesn't have the perfect hero. Darrow makes mistakes, and he makes plenty, and they have hefty consequences. A lot of these books made me cry at certain moments. Golden Sun, particularly, and Lightbringer kind of just took my heart straight out of my body, kind of turned it into mush, and then stuck it back in my chest, and I didn't know how to cope. I still think about these books, sometimes daily. They are my Roman Empire. I think the greatest aspect of this series, everything that happens between characters is so believable. I think almost every aspect of this story is the best aspect. I cannot pick just one thing about these books. They're all 5-star. Like the series as a whole is a 5-star. If you haven't hopped on the Red Rising train, I urge you, man. This series is like the foundation of this channel. I will always talk up these books. I will always hype up Pierce Brown's work. If you haven't been convinced yet to pick them up, man, what are you waiting for? I don't think this will come as a surprise to anybody who's been a constant viewer of this channel. But number 1 has to be The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. It was the first ever book series I read in its entirety for myself, and it's the series that I've read the most consistently throughout my life. I first read these when I was in 6th grade. I'm about to do another reread. This is the benchmark of high fantasy and modern fantasy as we know it. J.R.R. Tolkien wrote one of the most incredible series ever written. We follow one of the most endearing cast of characters as they fight their way against a rising darkness. It's one of the greatest journeys you'll ever read. The best aspect to The Lord of the Rings. I don't know, it's everything. Everything to this series is perfect. If you enjoy fantasy in any way, it's somehow borrowing from The Lord of the Rings. It's somehow borrowing from the foundation that Tolkien set. It's a classic for a reason. It's the standard still today for a reason for all fantasy. And I really don't know if there's ever going to be anything that replaces Lord of the Rings in the #1 spot for me. It's so near and dear to my heart. I think part of the reason why I rate it so high is nostalgic purposes. But then when I try to look at it from just what I'm into as a reader, fantasy, science fiction, historical, like he just did it the best. That series is so impactful, and it's changed my life in so many different ways and at so many different times. And it's definitely a 5-star series. Everything is 5 stars. I really can't tell you anything that I hate about those books or that I dislike or that I wish Tolkien would have changed. I just take it for what it is. And we get to read in this amazing epic story a lifetime of imagination. Outshines everybody else in this field, everybody else in this genre. I'm sure there's people that disagree with this list, and I'm sure there's people that disagree with what I've said. That's the beautiful thing about booktube, is that it's all subjective. I have my opinion and you have yours, and we can show each other grace, and we can agree and we can disagree, and we can still connect across the world over our shared love of reading. And I'm looking forward to seeing your guys' comments about your top 10s or your favorite series. Folks, thank you so much. That is the top 10. Thank you guys so much for being here. Thank you guys so much for sticking around. And thank you so much to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Head on over to squarespace.com to start a free trial today, or go to squarespace.com/IanGubeli for 10% off your first website and/or domain. Without further ado, I will see you in the next one.